Do you want to join in on the fun? Yes, I'm talking to you. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. Number one is that it's free, and there are creating tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. It's a one-stop shop for podcasting. Don't delay. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Do it right now.
Thunder, thunder, over Thunder Road. Thunder was his engine, and white lightning was his load. Moonshine, moonshine, to quench the devil's thirst. The law, they never got him, 'cause the devil got him first.
You are listening to the Moonshine, Murder, and Mayhem podcast. Episode 3, The Rest of the Story.
The 1958 movie Thunder Road, starring Robert Mitchum, epitomized our glorification of running shine. In this movie, war vet Lucas Doolin, played by Mitchum, works in the family business dealing moonshine. He delivers the illegal liquor that his father distills across Kentucky and Tennessee. Lucas rides around in his 1957 Ford Fairlane 500 two-door sedan, getting into bad fixes with some bad people. Throughout the film, there is a stream of government raids working to dismantle the Doolin family business. They try to wait out the government, but Lucas is forced to throw caution to the wind and make one last ride down on Thunder Road. Thunder Road was loosely based in reality, the story of a moonshine runner in 1952 who crashed to a deathly end on Kingston Pike in Knoxville, Tennessee. Evidently, the incident was either witnessed or passed on to Mitchum, inspiring the movie. Slim Merritt, my great-grandfather, cab operator and moonshine runner, predates Thunder Road by 20 years. I believe that Slim was a Lucas Doolin sort of character, staying one step ahead of the law, or should I say, 1 foot in the grave. Slim ran his business during Prohibition. Dangerous, yes, but he had a wife and 3 kids to care for. During those times, you did what you had to in order to survive. Just a note, my research has led me to believe that though he operated during post-Prohibition, the county he lived and operated in still illegalized alcohol. Tennessee left it up to the counties to determine whether or not they'd lift Prohibition. Warren County voted on it a week after Slim died. Slim was apparently politically involved as well. In an article from the Chattanooga Daily Times dated September 25th, 1932, Republicans in Warren select Boyd chairman. I learned he was a member of the Republican Executive Committee. This gives us some insight into how much he cared about his community politically, even during a time of hardship. The title for this episode is a reference to the conservative American radio broadcaster at ABC News Radio. Paul Harvey's broadcast would always conclude with the tagline, "The rest of the story." Harvey's broadcast reach as many as 24 million people each week. Though I've decided to start off this podcast at the moment of his death, the events that followed his death are just as disturbing. Whoever was behind Slim's death was an absolutely sick individual. For this episode, my father and I sit down and discuss some of what happened. He relays to me as much as he can remember as it was told to him.
I do know some other things that my dad had told me.
He's referring to how Slim died. Pa Dude never told him the story directly.
I was not told that story. I'd heard it through Granny, but I'd not heard that through Daddy.
Okay.
I had heard, that he was a taxi operator and that he did bootleg whiskey. I know that, and I remember Dad telling me that when he was younger, a lot of the black men in town would say, "Oh, you're Slim's boy, aren't you?" They knew my grandpa very well. Of course, he died in 1937, so my dad did not know him at all. But I knew his daddy, which was my great grandfather, and his mother, which was my great grandmother, and they Oscar Payton and Josietta, and I knew them. I actually lived with them for a time while they were building the basement across the road where Granny lives at today. So I know Pa and Ma and remember them very well.
And Granny said that they didn't talk about it.
No, I've never heard anything, even that Daddy had related, that Pa or Ma, either one, had said anything about it. Of course, that was a era they had moved up from Katy Fork River, he and his brother, in about 1915, and settled over around Faulkner Springs. And then Pa had bought the farm and moved up where the nursery and the office and where Granny lives. About 1918 is when he actually moved in there. And I'm not sure exactly what time that my grandfather, Slim, built the house, which was just up the road going towards McMinnville, across from Minnie Whiteacre's house. There, I remember the old garage and shed there, and I remember the barn, which existed there when I was real little. The barn burnt down, but the garage and kind of the smokehouse or whatever, it stood for probably in the 80s before it was taken down. I don't know exactly how long he and Lilian were married, but I think Sonny was the oldest, and
He was 6.
He was 6, so they must have married sometime in the 20s. Of course, Prohibition and basically started all this is what happened, and of course farm life, and there was no, quote, social security or any kind of welfare back then in those days. You either worked and earned a living or
You died.
you went hungry.
Yeah.
And of course, he having 3 young children and farming a very poor farm. The farm where the nursery is today is a very, very poor farm. It wasn't a rich, fertile soils like where they moved off the river. That was very rich and fertile down there, and it was very easy to grow crops there. Where we live at today is not that same type of soil and stuff. So they done what they could to survive, I'm sure. I remembered my daddy telling that my great-grandpa and Slim, my grandpa, would hew cross ties out of the woods by hand, and that Pa could actually carry a green cross tie out of the woods on his shoulder. So, you know, they were tough individuals. Both were very tough individuals.
Just to put this in perspective, a green, as in a freshly cut wood railroad tie, would weigh in at 250 pounds. Also, take into account that none of that area is flat. Although his father never mentioned the death of Slim, he did mention this story to my dad.
I do know that back to the time of his death, that my daddy relayed to me that either the sheriff confiscated, I'm not sure, I always thought it was the sheriff, confiscated both vehicles that were left to Lilian and the boys. He come in after Slim's death, Otis's death. He come in and confiscated both those vehicles.
I scoured through countless articles of the McMinnville local newspaper, the Southern Standard. I couldn't find any articles or gossip columns that even mentioned a fire or vehicle confiscation. At the time, each community designated a writer for that area. So if someone didn't want something talked about, I'm guessing it probably didn't get published. This leads us to the question, where did the taxi go? I emailed the Department of Safety. They directed me to the Department of Revenue, and then they said to contact the local Department of Title and Registration. I called them, only to find out they don't keep records past 5 years.
And my dad told me that one of the vehicles was driven by him for several years after that. You know, and you think about that, that's a very cruel thing to do to a widow and 3 young children, to actually come in and confiscate their means of transportation for whatever reason and leave them basically destitute. You know, I do not know how quickly after that their house burnt. And so that was another thing. I do not know anything about that. I don't know if someone burned it, if it was an accident or anything, because my dad never knew, I don't think, anything about that.
Again, let's lay this all out. It's the Great Depression, and World War II was just about to change the entire country. Slim dies, and the next thing you know, his vehicles, including his taxi, are confiscated by law enforcement. The house mysteriously catches fire. My great-grandmother Lilian, a stay-at-home mother with no income of her own, is now suddenly the sole provider for 3 young boys.
Yes, and of course, there again, you're also in the Depression, the results of the Depression, that era there. And then right after the Depression, you fall into the war, and the war had a lot of restrictions, a lot of limitations. You couldn't buy all the coffee that you wanted to buy. I remember Daddy talking about, of course, they were like us. They spent a lot of time in the creek, and Daddy said one time he was down there, and this was during wartime, and found several bags, like a couple 100-pound of coffee. And of course, Pa hauled it up to the house, but see, coffee was rationed. There was all sorts of rations at that time, so that was just like a finding gold to find that. And that was something that helped them during that time, just...
Lilian was falling apart, as was the world around her. Now, we haven't really spoken of Lilian, but my dad recalls a story about her.
Oh, yes, I remember Lilian very well. When we would go up, we'd stay in the house with her, and she died when I was probably 9.
Yeah, January 8, 1969.
Well, I was 8 actually, and I actually remember probably when I was 6. I'm thinking about 6. We were up there, and she bought us all bicycles. She bought Daryl and myself. They were, I want to say, 20-inch or 24-inch bicycles. Of course, we were little, and we wore those bicycles out. We rode those things. I remember riding that bicycle till I was like 12 or 13 years old. And it was wore out. The wheels would wobble and everything. We wore those bicycles out, yeah. We weren't big enough to get on them and ride them when we first got them. We had to get on a hill and kind of jump on, get a running start and jump on it, yeah.
This next clip you're going to hear is a story passed down to my dad about a fateful event involving my Pa Dude's relatives soon after Slim's death. And just to help you keep up, the Pa my dad refers to is his dad's grandfather.
And I know that Dad was kin to the Allisons some way or another through his mother. I don't know if you know the story about that. After his daddy died, and then I guess Lilian was forced to leave town or left town on her own, but one of the Allisons men come to get Pa and come to get my daddy, Uncle Bud, and Uncle Sonny and take them home with them. And Daddy says, I remember Pa standing out by either that pear tree or the ash tree that's right there in front of the office, and he had his double-barrel shotgun, and he told Mr. Allison not to step onto the property. And give him a very strict and firm warning, and Mr. Allison did not step on the property. Yeah,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I do remember that. So I do not know what all went on in that time frame. Some of the older people that's done passed on might have been able to tell us a little bit more, but I don't ever remember Daddy talking about and telling anything about Pa mentioning it or any of the neighbors, saying anything about it. Just do not know.
Did you catch that? Let's play it again.
Lilian was forced to leave town or left town on her own.
So Lilian left town, she took off, dropped her 3 young boys off with her parents, and left with no intention of returning. What happened? Did someone force her out of town? What was she running from? Or whom? We'll get into that next time on the Moonshine, Murder, and Mayhem podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Moonshine, Murder, and Mayhem podcast. If you have any information, please contact us at moonshinemurderandmayhem@gmail.com or message us on the Facebook group